Welcome, my name is Sebastian, scBürgel.eth, VP Tech at Gnosis and founder of HOPR. And I want to talk about something that started as a discussion of the Cypherpunk retreat about 2 months ago in Berlin. And there was a conversation that we started there and had an ETH research forum afterwards, and has been a collaboration since then, mostly of Rich, aka the Wandering Editor, as a Summer of Protocols attendee at myself. So yeah, just wanted to say thanks for these organizations which support not just the technical developments, but also kind of the meta level growing up that we as an ecosystem have to do. All right, and with that, yeah, I want to get started. I promise this will be a positive talk, but I want to get some unfortunate news out of the way. Like, this was from the BBC. Usually when the BBC is involved, that's bad news for some reason. And yeah, as most of you have seen, there was some attack on Bybit that unfortunately allowed North Korea to extract over $1 billion from our ecosystem. And yeah, only a bit over a week ago, we've all been probably facing this balance of V2 exploit. I would like to highlight attention to the second line here, how many chains and environments found themselves soft and hard forking and having painful discussions around that. And yeah, there's more issues. This one might seem a bit obscure. This is basically an issue that we were facing at HOPR. We're building a mixnet, on top of which we're building a VPN right now. And yeah, we have been very fundamental issues with processing events from Ethereum. ETH_get_logs is broken. And another issue that we've been seeing recently, I don't know if you can see it on this beautiful screen, there was an outage earlier this year of AWS that took out not just the Web 2, but also the better parts of the Web 3, which is a bit a pity, as Lefter is nicely highlighted here. So in this talk, I want to be focusing on what is maybe not the worst economically speaking, but you know, the one that was closest to me and that I spent most of my time on over the past 6 months. Yeah, and I think shows just how much there's something broken in this ecosystem. And that is the issue around ETH_get_logs that we're processing at HOPR and what it means. This sounds very technical, but I want to give a bit of context to take us on the journey. These things might seem random and disconnected, but I will show some connection that I hope you see at least later. All right, so let's dive in and start by zooming out. What are the most fundamental features that you expect any blockchain to really have? You can write to it, and you can read from it, right? So the write part is kind of obvious and is what gets most of the attention, typically by sending transactions. Lots of discussions around how making that credibly neutral. But actually, really, a blockchain is just a database, and you only write to it because you have the expectation that you can later on read from it also, right? So we kind of take that for granted, but I will spend some more time on reading from a blockchain and why that is actually important, that we just take for granted. All right, so how does reading actually work? Well, reading a general purpose ledger like Ethereum is actually a bit more complicated, right? So we're not talking about Bitcoin, we're talking about a general purpose ledger. And that one, you basically can process all your past transactions and accumulate the current state, right? And that means things like your Ethereum balance, ERC20 balances, and so on, right? So that is something what basically an Ethereum execution layer node does, but that is extremely computationally expensive and comes with hundreds of gigabytes of data overhead. So that's painful to establish. So there's another way that people introduced, which is processing of logs, right? So instead of processing your entire history of data, you're basically just listening, and every now and then a smart contract just emits an event, and it can much more cheaply and easily process this event in real time, right? This is the endpoint, what's called ETH_get_logs, and these logs are being processed, and you use that in your wallet, for example, for your ERC20 transfers, which you can then see, and your wallet shows that, your accounting software shows that, and so on. So that's meant as a much more easy way to go ahead. Or so we thought. How we use that at HOPR is actually, HOPR is a mixnet of hundreds of peers around the net. which are sending information to one another. And we have payment channels for an incentive layer for that, right? And these payment channels actually need to establish the state of the network. You need to know, who am I connected to, right? And it turns out for us that there was an issue. And after literally weeks of debugging really obscure issues, we found that this radio station that we're connected to, which is basically an Ethereum client that is sending data, or an RPC provider that you're connected to, doesn't actually do a very good job in that. And yeah, so what we actually found is this is an actual error, we will see it later on in a bit more detail, is like, it tells our HOPR node, which is running on this, that, hey, reopen this payment channel. And the HOPR node was, what the hell are you talking about? Like, this payment channel is closed and is not closed, but open. That's weird. We have something that went missing here. So what's actually happening, this is the actual issue, and somewhere down here, which doesn't fit in the resolution, you saw exactly the message from the previous screen, that basically we failed to process events. And failing to process events is really a very fundamental feature that Ethereum provides for us, right? It's a very fundamental step in processing events and just getting to the latest state. If that is broken, the reading from the blockchain is kind of broken, right? That is a very, very sad state in which we are in right now. All right, next one, please. So the problem is, if we look at ETH logs, well, again, a little bit poor resolution, but so what you should see on this screen here is actually the specification of ETH logs. And there we're getting towards the issue that I would like to talk about. And that is, we say we have a standard, but what we actually have here is just a couple of lines of an example. So it's basically something like a Swagger example, like request and response, which has been helpful for airing out, some very basic operational, making sure that your type is correct and so on. But otherwise, that is all. That is all that tells you how an Ethereum execution layer client is to process events. And when we see some much more nuanced edge cases, like the one that I just presented, where we just process a bunch of events, and these events are just coming in out of order, well, that is not captured in these very minimal standards. So I will talk a bit more about standards here. So first of all, these issues that I just mentioned, we're not the only ones to see them, right? So ETH logs is actually something that's difficult to process, and a bunch of clients have realized, okay, processing events on Ethereum is actually so difficult, so we make some trade-offs here, right? So we make some trade-offs for you, such as, we only allow you to process the past, 5,000 blocks or something, and we basically cut corners. And that is understandable, for example, for an RPC provider, because otherwise you have kind of an unbounded cost, right? But what that means is that every application layer developer like us is kind of facing a variety of kind of unhappy paths and failure cases that you just, have to figure out how to deal with. And also for client teams, they're confronted, so these are examples of every single Ethereum execution layer client, issues with ETH logs from the last 12 months, right? So if you just go into GitHub and search for ETH logs, you'll find a bunch of kind of very, very messy things here. So even if you don't care about HOPR, right? Even if this, payment channel network that we're working on kind of means nothing to you, this is something that Ethereum should support, right? So this is something which should be a standard. It's something that Ethereum should support, but it's broken all over the place and for a very long time, right? And that is a problem, right? And there might be people, hey, Sebastian, like, Ethereum is working fine for me. Like, what are you actually talking about, right? I get it, right? And this is part of the problem. So why is there no perception even of things being so broken as I just showed? So I think there's a number of reasons, and the first one is that teams don't actually talk about it, and even the issues I showed on GitHub is just the tip of the iceberg. You are just not going to GitHub and file an issue every single time you run into something. It's also a bit of a dick move to just go, hey, your stuff is broken, just DM me, right? We can sort it out. So there's some weird social pressure on this. The second one is, for many applications, you do get away working with Alchemy and Fura or whoever your RPC provider is. In many cases, that is okay. But that, again, basically provides even less incentives for people to fix issues, right? And the third one is that in many of these cases, it's not just people dealing with this. It's also that people are questioning themselves, right? You look at this and you're like, really? Is Ethereum that broken? I literally, after we tweeted about it, I had people reach out to me and were like, hey, Sebastian, I was just debugging something, from major projects in the space, and I had a corrupt database. And if you debug a corrupt database, there's been layers of software stacks on top of that before you get there. So people are really going crazy and challenging themselves before they realize, well, actually, an Ethereum execution layer client is really that broken. So, yeah, how do we get there? A few things I heard is, Sebastian, there really is no issue. And I would say, well, lol, no. As the previous slide showed, there's a bunch of issues for a bunch of teams that do show that there is kind of broken issues. The second kind of cynical explanation is devs don't know what they're doing. I would say that is a little bit too narrow view. Like ETH logs is kind of hard to deal with. It's kind of messy and very nuanced in what you do with it. And there's many different ways on how these logs are actually being processed, right? So, you subscribe, you just get events, you subscribe to an event, you have filters for it. It's not easy, granted, right? The third one is RPC providers are greedy. Well, guess what? RPC providers are companies. Companies make money. That's what companies do. Shout out to everyone who works on DAO, alternative revenue stream generations, and technology like that. That is why that is important, right? Because fundamentally, these companies aren't really exactly aligned with what we set out to do here. So, yes, and RPC providers, by cutting their cost, are looking what's the most expensive stuff that we're processing, and many times that is things like events, right? So that's where they cut corners, but again, breaking compatibility in absence of standards. And finally, I heard, well, client devs don't know what they're doing. That's the one that I most strongly disagree with. Some of the smartest folks that I know in the space are working on Ethereum client layer implementations, so that is certainly not the case. But it seems to be hard, right? So why is it that hard? We have basically some of the smartest people who are actually getting together in the space, who try to build something, to do the good thing, and they have to deal with this. And the actual situation is because their work environment looks more like this. They are trying to build clients, and we are having unanswered questions that we don't have consensus on. For example, let's stick to the basic example of, ETH logs example again. It's something that a smart contract emits. For example, when you transfer an ERC20 token, right? An ERC20 token, let's say you want to find out all wrapped ETH that Vitalik ever, transferred. So you basically look from Genesis block to the tip of the chain and want to find out, give me all transfers of wrapped ETH of, where Vitalik.eth, the address of Vitalik.eth, was either the sender or recipient. Is that a valid use case? Is that something that clients should support? Because you basically need to search through the entire logs from Genesis to tip, and, well, that's computationally expensive. So people cut corners there. We don't have consensus on that. And why do I bring this up and want to talk about it? Well, because my job is also VP Tech at Gnosis, where I get to talk to RPC providers and find myself in discussions, well, can we please get this to work? And like, hold on, Sebastian, what you describe is not a valid use case. I'm like, why? Show me the spec. And guess what? There's none. We don't have consensus on how an Ethereum client is supposed to work. So I did engage then in discussions on the all core devs testing call, and turned out we don't even have consensus on if we should get to standardizing clients. There's arguments such that I want to optimize my Ethereum client for ZK provability. That is an entirely different use case than me using it as an application layer developer, which again is an entirely different use case from somebody who just wants to run a validator to make money, right? The Lido people and I have very different goals in how they use Ethereum. Should we use the same client? Like Ethereum talks about client diversity, right? Client diversity is something that we uphold very strongly. But like, where does that get us if we have one client that's made for ZK provability, another one that's made for kind of staking, and another one that's made for application layer? then basically we're in a situation where I am in right now with my dApp node right now. I don't have many clients that I can actually run, right? Because disk footprint is the other dimension to optimize for. So yeah, all of this is basically just saying that we have a staggering lack of standards in Ethereum land. If we don't get together to talk about this, we're going to end up in a tough spot. And to come, to get a bit more positive here, so what you should see here, these are the Hive tests, right? So for the ones who don't know what Hive is, it's basically a testing suite for execution layer clients of Ethereum. And what we see here, like in September when I prepared this ETH research post, like there was like a number, it basically shows how many tests are failing for every of the 7 execution layer clients. And what we see on a higher resolution screen is that these passing test is going up over time. So that's great, right? So thanks, execution layer client teams for working on this, taking this seriously. This has not been moving for at least half a year that I've been watching it. For the past 3 months since we brought some public attention to this, things started improving, and that's great. Thanks for that. But if we're honest about it, I said this is also about Ethereum growing up, right? So what you see here is something on the order of 190 RPC compatibility tests, right? So that includes the trouble that I talked about on ETH-get logs. 190 tests, and like roughly 50%-ish are green passing, which is not fantastic. Where should we be? I have no idea, but let's look at, another example. Let's look at the web platform test, right? So let's look at what the other folks did who built a web back in the days and got eventually around of saying, hey, we need to standardize that because everything is utterly broken. I have so many browser forks in my JavaScript code that I just can't make any progress anymore. And well, they came up with a bunch of tests which are used for every major browser, right? So every major browser is using these things to check if their stuff works. And what I want to highlight is the number on the bottom. Every major browser has a, mostly passing number of tests, which is 2 million. There's 2 million tests. And I challenge everyone who tells me, well, a browser is more complex than Ethereum. It's not. Ethereum can do so much, right? And, us having basically, how many orders of magnitude is that? Like 4 orders of magnitude, like less tests for all of Ethereum's application layer interface, which is the RPC layer, has. Well, that's ridiculous. We need to level up, and we need to level up by orders of magnitude, right? And that's basically my point here of getting that message out and getting us committed to get towards something like that. I'm not saying let's build the web, but let's get there. So let's zoom out again, right? So that was very technical. We're diving into ETH-get logs, and I hope my point here is that Ethereum clients, really need to get together to improve the interface of people to work on Ethereum. But there's more issues than that, right? There's more issues than that, as we've seen in this very sad example. So what actually happened here, I would say, how do standards help us here? Well, actually, how could we have prevented this hack? I think there's no single or simple answer to that because a whole range of things went wrong here. But 2 areas of lack of standards that I would want to point out is A, the lack of security standards of wallets was obvious. Everybody who has kind of YOLO signed a hash on a ledger knows what I'm talking about. People call it like clear signing initiatives. I'm against that. There's no such thing as clear signing. Either I'm signing something that I understand or I'm YOLO signing, right? So I'm against the notion of clear signing. This is normal signing, right? You understand what you're signing, not just some random hash. So, well, truth is, most retail hardware wallets don't support any of that. They crop payload, and yeah, we're nowhere really there in rolling out useful standards in practice today. And the second one is, this happened in safe infrastructure, right? Safe infrastructure is centrally hosted by the safe team. Why, right? Why wasn't Bybit running their own? Well, because we don't have a standards for how this kind of secure DevOps infrastructure could be operated and run. This is kind of the second domain that I would like people to spend much more time on thinking, how can we standardize that stuff to make Ethereum actually secure? Because you know what? Actually secure is not just about your wallet. It's also about all the infrastructure stack around it. Let's look at the next one. So the balancer hack, right? So this looks like Berachain. Everybody likes to make fun of Berachain, me too. But many other chains also were finding themselves not just in a soft and hard fork discussion, including Gnosis. And you can imagine, I find that very contentious. So, but you find yourself basically discussing a soft and a hard fork in a war room setting where there's an active exploit and the attacker can literally move millions of dollars. You're finding yourself in that setting, and in that setting, you now have to discuss the ethical considerations of a soft and a hard fork. I can tell you, I have had many discussions in my life. That is not a setting in which I want to have these discussions. I would rather not talk about soft and hard forks because I would like there to be some standard of how we handle these things, right? But certainly not in a war room. All right, so especially this last one is contentious. I mentioned it, right? So for many people, it's like this. It's kind of getting us back to a corporate culture, cop-out environment. And that's not the culture, that's not what I'm suggesting, right? Because I know how you feel about it, and I know you feel more about it like this, right? And I understand it. So my point here is just, standards are not this, right? So standards are basically about trying to get things right on our terms. Because if we don't do it on our terms, somebody is going to impose standards on us. And in the previous panel, we heard something about GDPR and things. Yes, I also think that GDPR is a standard, A. B, it has the right intention, and it's rolled out in a horrible fashion. Like cookie notices and me having to pay a lawyer to protect people's privacy is not helpful, right? It's just bad. Why does it happen? Frankly, because all of us, that includes myself, we didn't get our shit together to protect people's privacy adequately. So somebody else stepped in, which for God's sake is the European Union in that case, to try to take a stance. So if we step up to bring up standards, we can improve things on our terms. And secondly, what I would like to think about is, well, I bring this up because otherwise things keep happening, right? It's just not good enough to say we stand for privacy, right? Well, why do things still happen? Because large companies in the space know that everybody will be angry when Ledger was doxing their entire database for the 12th time on the dark web. And 2 weeks afterwards, it will be back to business as usual. We need to set better standards for this industry. The next one is, if I think about privacy, like things do go wrong all the time, right? And if things go wrong all the time, we kind of get less attentive to what is actually going on. And I would kind of challenge you and say, okay, well, if you just talk about this in your value statement, but you're not willing to take any actual steps towards privacy, right? Something tangible. Are you actually privacy-oriented, or are you just a performance artist, right? We need to set these standards so that we can actually get there. We need to really take these actionable steps to not just have the European Union like march in and impose stuff on us. And finally, so taking a stance on these standards is a punk thing to do. That's my point here, right? So taking action to improve something on our terms for a better outcome is punk. Caring is punk. And Ethereum needs standards punk. Thank you for that, and happy to take the discussion afterwards.